right, so we're a little late after the chaos, so I'm going to turn it over to our very scholarly-looking person sitting here making notes and looking very professorial. And where's your tweed elbow patches?
Oh, I love
the Sherry. Great Brechin, everybody, who is the world's expert on the history of the stadium, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to say.
Okay. I forgot that I had written an article about this in the Berkeley Daily Planet, the late Berkeley Daily Planet, 3 years ago, before they started the reconstruction of it. So I thought I'd just read you the first 2 paragraphs of that, and then I'll give it to Brian, the electronic version, so that you can all get a copy of it. With the alacrity of a dying sloth, the San Francisco Chronicle waited until the University of California had evicted and arrested the remaining tree sitters at California Memorial Stadium before asking what it should have at the top of the hour. Is the stadium safe, and can it ever be made safe enough to accommodate anyone, let alone 75,000 spectators? The front page of the September 21st sporting section featured an article entitled "Stadium on the Brink," with a photograph of rotted wooden seats and the lead sentence that the structure would be, quote, "definitely the worst place to be as a player or a fan or anyone else during an earthquake." 4 days later, reporter Carolyn Jones detailed the latest plans to make safer a structure straddling a fault that is cocked, loaded, and ready to rip. She gave the university's public relations frontman, Dan Moguloff, final word. He said, "We remain completely confident that we're compliant with the Alquist-Priolo Act," insisted Moguloff. "We're excited to finally move forward with this retrofit project. Our primary goal has always been safety." That is completely untrue. As so much else that Dan Moguloff says has been. And so the title of that was Public Relations, again, Trump's Public Safety at UC Berkeley. So the question is then, why was Memorial Stadium built where and when it was? Because that's not where the campus architect, John Galen Howard, or anyone else had intended it to be. It's actually a terrible location for a stadium, although a spectacular one. So I know quite a bit about the original plan for the university. It was the Phoebe Hearst the Phoebe Hearst International Competition and Plan for the university. The architect who took that over and who designed the core of the campus, that classical core, was John Galen Howard, a graduate of the École des Beaux-Arts, a very accomplished architect, who also, by the way, designed the Naval Architecture Building and the Northgate Hall just across campus. That's now the Journalism School. Wonderful buildings in the sort of Berkeley shingle tradition. So he could work in any kind of style. He was very adept, like Julia Morgan, who also, of course, went here. Collegiate sports, as you probably know, really sort of gets going in the late 1890s, turn of the century. It largely corresponds with Spanish-American and Philippine-American wars at that time and the growing attitude of imperialism in the country. The campus itself was spoken of, John Galen Howard spoke of it, as being a kind of a white acropolis, a sort of bastion of white civilization on the far Pacific Rim. When the Hearst Mining Building was dedicated across the way, he had arranged the entire university around a central axis, which is, the remains of that is Memorial Glade in front of the library. And the initial plan was to align Memorial Glade with University Avenue so that you would have continued straight on to campus in the French manner, where the university and the town and the gown are integrated. That's not the way that Americans like to build their universities. They like to build it apart from the corrupting influences of the city around it. So we have campuses. So when John Galen Howard took over, he made a very interesting shift. He shifted the axis 5 degrees to the south so that it doesn't line up with the town grid. It goes, when you're up on the hill, the axis goes over the city's rooftops aimed at the Golden Gate, which is not the line of University Avenue. And he said when the Hearst Mining Building was dedicated, it stood for the axis of the university stood for alma mater's peaceful and beneficent conquest of the Pacific Ocean. Okay? So as I point out in my book, Imperial San Francisco, during the war, the 184-inch cyclotron was deliberately built at the head of the axis at the top of the hill, and that's where they began separating the U-235, that was some of which was used for the bomb that obliterated Hiroshima. The axis stands for alma mater's peaceful and beneficent conquest of the Pacific Ocean. Okay? But they didn't know about the atomic bomb at that time. Collegiate sports really gets going around the time of the Spanish and Philippine-American Wars. And they begin to build some large stadiums at that point. But the real sort of golden age of stadium building is after the First World War. Again, it's linked with warfare. And the stadiums that are built at that time are large and quite grand in many ways. Often Roman, sometimes Gothic, like the one at Princeton. They generally have to do with the architecture of the universities at that time. And they were, the reason that they were ostensibly built is that they were memorials to the gallant alums who had died in the First World War. So that's why it's California Memorial Stadium, although nobody thinks anymore about those alums who died in the First World War. It's simply the stadium. Usually the people just call it Cal Stadium, of course. So that there was, what they were doing was they were playing on the patriotism of people at the time of the First World War. And that was good for getting a lot of donations, particularly from alums, to build the stadium. So the real push to build Cal Memorial Stadium begins around 1921. But in 1919, a number of things happened that's going to play a big role in getting the stadium built. The president of the university for 20 years had been Benjamin I. Wheeler, a Greek scholar, who disagreed with John Galen Howard, his architect, because Howard was a Roman. He was a proponent of the Roman. And Benjamin I. Wheeler was a Greek scholar. So they had big arguments over Doe Library, which Wheeler felt looked too Roman. It's a big basilica rather than something more Greek. He got his way when Hearst gave the money for the Hearst Greek Theater, so he was happy with that. But they might have come to loggerheads about the Memorial Stadium because it's patterned after a Roman Colosseum. But he was out of the way by that time because during the First World War, he had gotten his schooling in Germany and was friends with Kaiser Wilhelm at that time. And that didn't make him very popular with the regents. So the muscle was put on him, and he retires in 1919. Phoebe Hearst dies in the flu epidemic in 1919. John Galen Howard sort of holding on by his fingernails because he's lost his two big supporters at that time. And the president that the regents choose is David Prescott Barrows, a military man who had essentially been working in the Philippines remodeling their education system. He is gung-ho, he's a military man, and he wants a stadium, a big one. And what's the reason for building a stadium? I found it in an article on the stadium in the Overland Monthly, which was the literary magazine at that time, published in San Francisco. And it said, since the World War, the stadium building impetus has gained surprising headway, due in large measure to national consciousness of growing physical defectiveness, which the draft examinations of 1917 so glaringly exposed. Okay? What they had discovered during the draft examinations is what poverty and hard work do to young men. That young men were not prepared to fight unless they'd gone through a lot of feeding and conditioning because they were broken by 19 and 20. And so what you do to get them to fight in shape to fight another war is you have sports. That'll condition them if they're going, because The male students who came to the university at that time, because it's a land-grant college, were required to go through military training to pay for what you pay. You pay tuition. At that time, the male students did a mandatory military training, and there were military drills all over the campus and up in the hills, etc. You could see the boys out there, and it was because it was considered that male students who had gone to UC would be fit to be commissioned officers, to train the grunts who hadn't had the opportunity of a university education. And the training is done on the field, whether that's the track field or the football field or whatever. Just as a sidebar, that wasn't so necessary when we went into the Second World War because of what I'm studying now, and that's part of that is the New Deal. 3.5 million young men had gone through the Civilian Conservation Corps. They were well trained. They were buffed. They were in great shape, and they were ready to go off and fight in the war, which wasn't the case in the First World War. Okay, so they wanted to have a facility, at least partly, for training men for military action. The first plans for the stadium, there were a number of different sites. They were going to be on the west side of campus or completely off campus. The favored site was going to be down where Edwards Field is now. Now remember at that time, the university's southern boundary was Strawberry Creek. So the university over the years has moved south to Bancroft Avenue, but at that time it was Strawberry Creek. So to build a stadium covering 22 acres at the southwest corner would mean that they would have to acquire that land by eminent domain and demolish a lot of houses, a lot of them rooming houses down there, and that would be expensive. Probably the better idea would have, there was a proposal to build it down on University in Sacramento in mid-Berkeley. And the reason for both of those sites is access and public transportation. Remember, the campus, the downtown was very well served by electric trolleys at that time, as was California and Sacramento Street, both of which had trolleys on them. Also, that was still, to some extent, open land down there. It's also flat, so it would be easy to build it. Now, Stanford had just built a dirt bowl auditorium for 60,000 people, costing $210,000. And so how could Berkeley be left behind when Stanford had done that? Okay, so there's rivalry going on here too. They begin in 1921 a fund drive for alums to raise money for a stadium which the donors were led to believe would be down on that site, probably. Its axis would have been on Ellsworth Street. It would have been an oval with an axis on Ellsworth Street. In December of I think it's December of 1922. In December, the Regents have a meeting and they switch the locus of the stadium. And we'll probably never know why they did it. I've got some ideas, but we will probably never know. I suspect they did it in an executive session. But it wasn't where anybody was expecting the stadium to go. And that's why I call this bait and switch, because the donors had been led to believe it was going to be in one place, and all of a sudden it was going to be in another. And a very well-beloved space, too. Because the entrance to Strawberry Canyon at that time looked very different than it does now. It was a constricted mouth, very narrow, actually. You have to go back and look at the topo maps and the photographs. It was a beautiful location. The creek came out of and it was a year-round creek, came out of the canyon and immediately shifted north because the fault moving north had moved it. And the geology classes used it for that reason. And then it went west again. It basically goes down Memorial Glade. That was the offset. And people loved that canyon because it was a way to get up into the hills. And the canyon at that time was largely natural with some dairy farms up there, a lot of springs, etc. And when the Botanical Garden was moved from where Haviland Hall is, they had first moved it up into the mouth of the canyon. So that's where the University's Botanical Garden was. It had also been declared a nature refuge. So it was an official refuge for wildlife and used as a botanical laboratory at that time. All of a sudden, the Regents announced that there's going to be a monster stadium built on that site. Oh, and also the other thing is that there were a lot of people, especially professors, living up on Panoramic Hill and building their houses up there. Some of them very distinguished and powerful professors. Among them, a professor of philosophy named Charles Reber. Reber lived in the very large brown shingle house that you see on the south end of the stadium overlooking the stadium now. I talked to his daughter before she died, and she told me how incredibly embittered he was when the announcement was made. He was so embittered, actually, he fought it, that when it finally went into construction, he sold the house, and as an act of revenge, moved to Los Angeles to be one of the founding people of UCLA, what was called the Southern Campus at that time, because he just couldn't stand to be in Berkeley anymore. So when the announcement was made, it just ripped Town and Gown apart. Up until that time, Town and Gown in Berkeley were actually very close together. The town people were very, very proud of the university being in their town. There would be pageants at the Greek Theater in which townies and gownies would get together. But in 1923, with the stadium being built, the Town and Gown just split. It split the university. It was almost as controversial as the Hetch-Hetchy battle, which had happened earlier, which also split the place apart too. But this one really split the town because of the site. I mean, NIMBYs are nothing new. They were around at that time. Not in my backyard, if you don't know NIMBY. We didn't have environmental impact reports, but people knew that something really bad was going to happen up there, and it was a lousy place to build it. So I've gone into the Bancroft Library and looked at some of the records. There are a lot of them. Not as much research as I'd like to do, because I'd like to get to the root of why that decision was made. And the protests were just what you'd expect. Not only would it destroy a nature area, and a beloved area, but it was in a constricted site, which was very difficult of access in case something terrible happened. And what could that terrible thing be? Well, they knew about the Hayward Fault at that time. I wondered for a long time, well, they knew about the San Andreas. They knew about the Hayward Fault. One of the best seismic geologists was here on campus, Andrew Lawson. And they knew perfectly well about the Hayward Fault. The geologists, engineers, and others were horrified at the idea that they were going to build a 70,000-seat amphitheater on top of an active earthquake fault. They would have to move the botanical garden yet again. And it's a fire zone. As a matter of fact, while they were building it in 1923, the Great Berkeley Fire happened in September, burning out 600 houses up in the Berkeley Hills while the stadium was being built. All of this was to no avail. They began building in January. I don't know how they did it. It's almost as if they had the plans ready, because they began building in January, and the deadline was, I think it was November 21st of the same year, for building a stadium seating 70,000. It was a rush job. They built the whole thing in about 11 months. And you can tell, actually, you could tell, by going up and looking at the quality of the construction, because it was a rush job. I went up with an architect and looked at it. You could see pieces of wood embedded in the concrete from the old forms. This was a hasty concrete pour. They blasted out what's now Charter Hill, Tightwad Hill. They used dynamite and hydraulic monitors, and that was brought down. They built a huge dike across the mouth of the canyon to capture the silt blasted down from the hill, and that created a platform of 250,000 cubic yards of loose fill on which the stadium is sitting. And that is, it's mapped as a known liquefaction site. So when the fault moves, not only will there be fault shear, but the whole thing will move west like a big slurry, because it's all saturated with water from Strawberry Creek, which goes underneath in a conduit, but in fact a lot of runoff is coming down through that alluvium. So the whole thing is unsteady. And then the hill up above, they wanted to blast the whole hill down, but that was stopped. The whole hill up above is unstable, and I'll come back to that in a little while. So they built this thing. The platform was built by March. Construction begins in January. Platform's built in March. They begin the construction. And it took place very, very fast. They get it built. They have the big game. I think 75,000 people came for that thing. And one of the reasons that they wanted to have it for the big game is they found with the Stanford Bowl that the big games actually paid so much, they were so profitable that they could pay for the stadium. And so they were able to pay it off within 10 years. The seating capacity was 70 to 75,000, and in fact, it wasn't cheaper than build. That was one of the reasons that they gave. It would be cheaper to build it up there, but they still had to buy a lot of land from private purchasers and move houses. The site down there would have been far cheaper, either of the sites. The ultimate cost, the Stanford Stadium cost $210,000. The Berkeley Stadium cost $1,400,000. That was a vast amount of money at that time. Okay? So let's see. So the stadium is built. They begin having big games in it on this active earthquake fault. And then with the war, Ernest Lawrence moves the cyclotron up onto the hill, and that forms the nucleus of what becomes the National Laboratories, the radiation labs up there, which is a gigantic and ever-growing industrial city, doing some rather hazardous research up in those hills up there. It was previously, of course, radioactive research. Now it's biotech and nanotech, about which we know almost nothing. But I can talk more about that later on. And it's all on extremely unstable hill slopes up there, because that is the ancient caldera of a volcano, the remains of which are down in Sibley Regional Park. But it moved along the faults. There are several faults up there. The Hayward is just the biggest one. And it's moved over the years north so that it's all up there, held back by a thin dam of sedimentary rock at the base of the hills, all of which is very, very unstable because those hills are extremely steep. So you've got a rather dangerous situation up there. But when the discussion came of what to do about the stadium, because everybody knew it was unsafe, being on the fault line, and the university swung into action, there never really was an option, as far as I can identify it, for moving the stadium off the site. It was always pretty much of a given that the stadium would stay on the site and that there would be a seismic retrofit, even though most engineers and architects, if they were honest, that you talked to, said they didn't know how to do it because the site is so dangerous. Although there's one hazard that they never mentioned. They were always talking about shear, not liquefaction and landslide. There was a big controversy. They eventually adopted the plan that's now going on up there, in which apparently the stadium will be designed to break safely into sections. If, God forbid, there's a game going on at the time, it will break up into separate, discrete sections. And they presume that people will remain seated while this is happening. Wouldn't you? I wonder if there will be safety belts up there on the seats to keep people in their seats. As the discussions were going on about what to do and how to build it and how to finance it, that was the big thing. How do you finance this? Because it's colossally expensive. A retired emeritus professor, probably the world's leading authority on the geology of the Berkeley Hills, Garnis Curtis, wrote a letter to the Regents, which got almost no play whatsoever. And Curtis said, under no circumstances should you build anything there. It's far too dangerous. And the reason for that was not just fault shear and liquefaction, but something that most of us had never thought about, and that's landslides. And so Curtis had studied the Berkeley Hills and discovered that in the event of major quakes on the Hayward Fault, what happens almost immediately is it dislodges vast amounts of a rock from the hills. That I had always thought that it was simply a lateral fault that just moves north. And, the west part moves north. What he revealed was that no, there's also a vertical component too. So it can move in a big fault, in a big quake, it can move about 6 feet laterally, but it can also move 2 feet up in the largest quake that they're predicting. Which means, and very few structures can put up with that kind of vertical displacement. But what happens in a case like that is that the thin sedimentary dam that's holding back the loose volcanic saturated stuff up there can let go. And he estimated that a landslide could reach as far as Doe Library. And that will bring the entire National Laboratory down onto the campus with it. That letter got virtually no publicity. The Regents completely disregarded it. The fix was in. They went ahead and they built the stadium. So, and I noticed by reading the signs, reading the PR, they say that the stadium will be safe once the retrofit is finished. That's a lie. You can only make the stadium safer, but to what degree is completely unclear. I don't think that stadium can ever be made safe. I would never attend a game in it, especially with 70 or 80,000 others. Oh, the other thing is, too, that the university has excused its irresponsibility, its criminal irresponsibility, in allowing that stadium to be up there by saying that, well, there are only 6 games out of the year, and so what are the odds of it happening? Yeah, well, nobody could have predicted the Loma Prieta earthquake happening when there was a World Series game at Candlestick Park either, but, these things do happen. Yeah, the odds are pretty small for the fault moving during one of the games, the 6 games out of the year. But they're building it for more activities, large activities, because the financing of it is so shaky that they're going to have more activities up there, like rock concerts, etc., in order to pay it off. They have to. And the other thing is, what they weren't telling is that a few decades ago, they actually remodeled the west side of the stadium, which was the most unstable, dangerous part of it, for classrooms and gyms, so that every day 500 people go to work or were going to work in that wall of the stadium. And when the thing is finished, it looks like there will be another 600 people who will be going daily to work in the stadium. So the stadium will be occupied every day by hundreds of people. And let's see. Well, that's enough to give you headaches, keep you up tonight. There's the mortgage problem. I'm not really going to go into that. I will go into it. I'm not really into that much into financing. The financing seems extremely fishy. But the question is that if the stadium behaves as it is designed to do, to break up into discrete parts when the fault moves, and still a large amount is owed on the mortgage, what are the Regents going to do with a wrecked stadium? Are they going to put it back together again, glue it back together after the demonstration of that? I doubt it. They're going to be stuck with a colossal bill for a wrecked stadium at that point. Oh, and the other thing is, when I was an undergraduate student here, the stadium was a favorite place for geology and engineering classes to go to look at where you shouldn't build. And it was great. I loved going up there because you could actually see the reinforced concrete spalling, twisting, and everything, and the rebar popping out as the stadium just torqued, and so the professors just loved it, but they were horrified at it at the same time. I'll just wrap up, since this is a class about sports, by saying that one of the things about intercollegiate sports, about sports in general, professional or intercollegiate, is that it enforces tribal solidarity, and that is enormous. And I ran into that when I ran this article, because I got hate mail, particularly from an undergraduate, who said, "What do you know what you're talking about?" That stadium is beautiful. And it is beautiful, in its own perverse way. And that's one of the things. It's a great place for watching a game, I've heard. And it's very magnificent in its site, but it should never have been built there. And it shouldn't be there now. But you can't say that, actually, because people will tear you apart. Because there is now so much history and team spirit and everything invested in that stadium that perhaps it was never an option that it could have been moved down to Golden Gate Fields or someplace where it would stand a chance. It's really an object lesson in the seemingly limitless capacity of humans for denial of what can actually happen. It would be interesting to see if they have an insurance underwriter who was silly enough to try to underwrite what could happen in that stadium and what has been known ever since it was built to happen in that stadium. Okay, well that's enough. I don't want to go on completely, so let's do some Q&A. I forgot to tell you the story of what happened to John Galen Howard. So John Galen Howard, who was a member of the Sierra Club, lived over on the hill over here until the fire came down and burned up his house. He didn't want to build the stadium up there. Remember, he's the supervising architect of the university. He's got first dibs on every building that's built. And he says, no, I don't want to build that. The Regent said, yes, you will. And he needed the money, and so he did. But it was such a nasty, apparently, confrontation with the Regents that the next year when he was traveling in Europe, he received a telegram telling him he was fired. In 1924, he was out of here. And it was probably largely because of the stadium controversy. So into a very illustrious career. But he didn't stick to his guns, I got to say. Okay, well that's it. Let's do some Q&A. Yeah?
Can you share your theories as to why how the stadium was built on a fault?
Because it was a spectacular site.
Question because I want you to think.
Oh yes, why was the stadium built on the fault? Spectacular site. The university owned most of the land, but they had to buy 6 acres, and those 6 acres were very expensive. There were some big mansions up there. What's the president's? Blake Mansion, yeah. That's where the Blake family lived. They were a wealthy family, and they had famous gardens that were up there. And so the university bought them out, and they moved up to Kensington, and there's an estate up there which the president is supposed to live in. It's a very lavish, you know the place, very lavish, beautiful place, maintained by the Landscape Architecture Department. But that was taken out. A lot of other houses were moved or demolished. As I said, the botanical gardens were taken out. It's really a mystery to this day. Nobody knows. I think it was an inside job.
But what was the law, maybe you were asking? Maybe the question had to do with, wasn't there any law that would have stopped that?
No, there was no law. There were no environmental laws. I mean, we have the Aquas Priolo Act now, which should have prevented them from rebuilding on the site, but they got through a little rider on a piece of legislation that went through the legislature that most people didn't notice. A few people around here did. It got no publicity, which essentially exempted them from rebuilding on the site. The Aquas Priolo Act was supposed to prevent things like that from happening. But the university was powerful enough to get it through the legislature. I think what happened is that there was a trio of people who designed the stadium. John Galen Howard was one. Then there were 2 engineers. One of them was Buckingham. His name was Buckingham. And I found evidence in the oral histories in the Bancroft Library, particularly by Walter Stylberg, who lived on Panoramic Hill. He said that there was a super salesman who mesmerized the Regents into building the stadium. And I think it was Buckingham, because elsewhere I found that he had family connections where he profited from building the stadium. So that would be a place to go looking at. The contracting company that built that stadium so quickly, I mean, it was great. It was hugely profitable to do so. So my feeling is that there was some skullduggery going on. Not uncommon, I might say. Yes.
I think it's... Anybody else?
I have a quick question.
Yes.
So currently now, this whole new stadium, it is because the UC Regents, I guess, are recognizing that it's in a dangerous location?
No.
So why, I'm not exactly following, isn't our new stadium being built because this current stadium is in a dangerous location?
No, that's the PR line that they're giving. They at first they said it would make it safer. Now they're saying it would make it safe, and that's not true. No, they have a very strong PR department to put out this. I read you what Don Magaloff said. We're excited to finally move forward with this retrofit project. Our primary goal has always been safety, and that's a lie. Because it's not safe. It can never be made safe. I would love to get him under oath in a courtroom on that, because it can't be made safe. But they have great PR. And so, a little sidebar here. I wrote my dissertation, Imperial San Francisco, which you can actually read, and I recommend you do so because I need the royalties, and it's a great read. It's a great read. People love my book. The last chapter is on the university, and one of the reasons I put in the chapter on the university was because I'd come here in 1967 as an undergraduate, and I thought, why is it that one of the world's greatest physicists of the 20th century, Robert Oppenheimer, doesn't have his name on anything on campus? And Ernest O. Lawrence does everywhere. And so I answer it in the chapter. And part of it's anti-Semitism, but a lot of it is that everybody associates Ernest Lawrence with the atomic bomb. And people don't associate they associate Oppenheimer with the atomic bomb. They don't associate Ernest Lawrence, although they should, because he had at least as much to do with it. So that so the university over the years, I've noticed, has done a terrific job of dissociating the public's mind from its association with weapons of mass destruction. The university really, the official line is that the university has 10 campuses. It actually has 12, because it's got one at Livermore and one at Los Alamos. And those two campuses are given equal billing with the other 10 at the university headquarters in Oakland. But it never talks about those because that would associate people would say, well, what business does a public university have developing hydrogen bombs? And that's an awkward question to answer. But this is all part of PR. If you go up to the Lawrence Hall of Science, there's a shrine to Ernest Lawrence in the middle of the building. There's no mention of the atomic bomb, and there's only one picture of Robert Oppenheimer standing with Lawrence. So it's been a very deliberate policy of obfuscation to dissociate people's minds from what the university really does for the government. Yeah.
Was there some kind of obfuscation, like you said, earlier in the days when they did decide to relocate the stadium, the construction of the stadium? Was there any public outcry or any social protest against this relocation?
Yeah, was there protest at the time? Yeah, it was, it just tore the town apart. It was extremely controversial. I mean, I think somebody should take this on as a project. I mean, here's a good research project. Go back and read the newspapers of that time. Not just the Berkeley papers, but the San Francisco papers. Find out how much discussion there was. And go into some of the papers of the professors at that time. I never had the time to, but I think Andrew Lawson's papers are here at the Bancroft Library. Go and find out what he was writing at the time. But the major papers that you'd want to look at are Charles Reber's papers, which are probably at UCLA. And I didn't have time to go down there and go into the library. But that would be most interesting to find out, because that probably contains what was known at that time.
Cool. Mm-hmm. And also just I'm personally pretty interested in how our leaders and people in power are able to not really come through with their promises, and kind of how they kind of dissociate themselves with their actual constituency, such as the Regents, supposed responsibility of directing the university in a good manner, I guess, in a safe manner. And so do you know of any consequences that were for the Regents that they got their reputation a little bit tarnished because of this decision?
No, Regents' reputations don't get tarnished, nor are they ever held responsible. They are completely unaccountable. It is a political appointee The cost these days is around $50,000 to the governor in political contributions. That's sort of the going rate, but more is welcome. And they are uniformly, except for the ones that are stipulated by the California Constitution, they are uniformly wealthy. They represent some of the biggest business interests, including construction. Maybe Ignacio knows this. I believe that the company URS, not a well-known company, but a very big construction company, did it have the contract?
They didn't.
Okay.
For the stadium.
Not for the stadium, but they do for the building that's going to link
For the,
law and business.
For the,
and it got the contract for that. That would be an interesting research project, too, to find out about that. So, I mean, there are all kinds of conflicts of interest. If you pick up this week's Bay Guardian, there's a long article in there called, right after the article on Project Censor, it's headlined Censorship or What? And it's an article that the independent investigative reporter Peter Byrne did on conflicts of interest with the Regents, particularly Richard Blum, and how it was censored by the San Francisco Chronicle for over a year, well, for about a year. And Peter lays out, with his emails and telephone calls chronologically, the interactions that he had with the Chronicle, which I will say libeled me, because I told the Santa Barbara student paper that I thought that who it was, but they had a representative on the Board of Regents at that time. And so citing a UC campus there immensely improved their bottom line. Ignacio?
May I ask a question?
Sure.
I've been watching these wonderful presentations you've had in this seminar in Europe. Thank you for putting them online. I've watched a couple, and they're really interesting. But the sense that is being reinforced from these talks is the incredible inevitability of all this. Mm-hmm. It's kind of shocking to hear people repeat this and see it in reality, in historical reality. I understand the inevitability of conflict of interest and the inevitability of business and self-serving and all that. But what I would like to hear you talk about is why sports and why specifically this football game. Do you have any thoughts?
As an inveterate sports hater, I don't. I have no interest in competitive sports whatsoever. I can find much better things to do with my life, like reading Mark Twain. So I recommend that to you, actually. But I don't know. I mean, that's what the class is all about. I assume, Brian would probably be better qualified.
Well, didn't you just say earlier that it was the military-industrial complex, basically?
Yes.
So if we were to dismantle the military industrial complex, would that affect this whole culture of sports?
I think we'd have a lot to do with it if you dismantle the military-industrial complex. I think it would, because there are a number of studies, sociological studies, of the connection of competitive sports with the military. There's a very clear tie between them. Swimming laps, which is what I do, isn't very conducive to a military, setup.
War game, yeah. Right. So it's symbolic value. It's a symbolic value.
It's symbolic, but I think it's tribal solidarity. It's sort of the root of patriotism. And I mean, you can see when you go to a game, if you go to a game, the way that it bonds people, huge masses of people together, sometimes to the point of literal insanity and brutality, as we've seen in recent games, where people are beaten to death.
To stop you there, and then we can go off there. Thank you so much. Tuesday instead of Thursday next week in 306
Chronicle leaned on the editor at Santa Barbara so that he took that out of the online version, which comes very close to libel, considering the editorial note that they inserted that this statement was insufficiently researched. Anyway, that's more than you wanted to know. But do pick up the San Francisco Bay Guardian. Yeah, I mean, One other thing, too, is when I was going to school here in the 60s, there was a great deal of student and faculty investigation of the Regents and their conflicts of interest. I have several of the publications of that time, and they make fascinating reading. Unfortunately, none of that kind of work is being done today, but it really needs to be done.
She has a question.
Just really quick, do you know how long it took them to pay off the cost of the initial stadium?
It was 10 years.
10 years, was it?
Although there was so much money from the big games that, in fact, actually was pretty much, 10 years is kind of stretching it out. They paid it off really fast.
And then Stanford paid it off in like the same time, too.
I think they paid it off with the first big game.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
They're profitable.
Yeah.
Oh, and one other thing, just to be fair. If that stadium was moved, it would be disastrous. I mean, if it was moved, say, like Golden Gate Field, it would be disastrous for local businesses because the businesses around here really depend on game days for doing business. I've talked to some of the merchants around here, and they're very dependent on it. Other questions? Yeah.
I think even the recent activities of the Regents in citing the UC Merced campus seem to have conflicts of interest where the Regents, some members of the Regents had real estate investments around the proposed site of the campus. They sort of took a real estate holding, divided it in two, gave half to the campus, and developed the other half for their own use.
That's always the case. Wherever a UC campus is located, it immensely increases the value of land, not only where it is, but around it. And so frequently there are regents or pals of regents who are very, very interested in where the university is going to be sited and to get in on the ground floor. UC Irvine's a great example of that. There was tremendous corruption involved in the siting of the UC